The flames licked hungrily at her feet, as 30,000 souls watched in horrified silence. The year was 1431, and in the market square of Rouen, a 19-year-old peasant girl was about to meet a death so brutal, so deliberately orchestrated in its cruelty, that even the hardened executioner would later confess his soul was forever stained by what he was forced to witness. This was not merely an execution. This was political theatre written in blood and ash, a spectacle of suffering designed to break not just a body, but the very spirit of French resistance itself. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the warrior saint who had dared to crown a king and challenge an empire, stood chained to a wooden stake, her fate sealed not by divine judgment, but by the calculated machinations of men, who feared her influence more than they feared God himself. What transpired on that May morning would haunt the witnesses for the remainder of their lives, and the true horror of her final moments has been sanitized by centuries of historical revision, buried beneath layers of martyrdom mythology that obscure the raw, unvarnished brutality of medieval justice. The crowd that gathered was unlike any execution audience in living memory. Nobles in silk and velvet mingled with merchants, craftsmen, and common laborers, all drawn by a morbid fascination with the downfall of the girl who had accomplished the impossible. English soldiers formed a protective cordon around the scaffold, their commander, the Earl of Warwick, having invested far too much political capital in this moment to allow any disruption. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation, heavy with the scent of fear sweat, and the acrid smoke already beginning to curl from the carefully arranged kindling below. But how had it come to this? How had an illiterate farmer's daughter from the remote village of Domremy risen to such heights that her destruction required an international conspiracy orchestrated by the most powerful men in Europe? The answer lies not in divine intervention, as Joan herself believed, but in the toxic intersection of religious fervor, political desperation, and the brutal pragmatism of medieval warfare during the darkest chapter of the 100 Years' War. Joan's origins were humble to the point of obscurity. Born around 1412 in a village that changed hands between French and Burgundian forces with the seasons, she grew up surrounded by the constant threat of violence. English raiders and their Burgundian allies regularly swept through the countryside, burning crops, seizing livestock, and leaving behind a trail of corpses and smoking ruins. This was a world where survival itself was an act of defiance, where the concept of French national identity was being forged in the crucible of foreign occupation and civil war. The France of Joan's youth was a kingdom in its death throes. The catastrophic defeat at Agincourt in 1415 had shattered French military confidence, leaving the country divided between those who supported the rightful Dauphin Charles VII and those who threw their lot in with the English claimant to the French throne. The Duke of Burgundy, theoretically a French noble, had allied himself with England, creating a three-way power struggle that reduced entire regions to ash and bones. Cities changed hands multiple times, their populations subjected to sieges, sackings, and the casual brutality that medieval warfare visited upon civilian populations. In this chaos, religious visions and prophetic claims flourished like poisonous flowers in fertile soil. The Catholic Church, fractured by the Great Western Schism, struggled to maintain doctrinal authority, while competing factions claimed divine endorsement for their political ambitions. It was into this spiritual wasteland that Joan's visions emerged, not as isolated mystical experiences, but as part of a broader pattern of apocalyptic fervor that characterized the late medieval period. When Joan first presented herself to the court of the Dauphin in 1429, claiming that Saints Michael, Margaret and Catherine had commanded her to drive out the English and see Charles crowned at Rheims Cathedral, she was not the first to make such claims. The difference lay not in the content of her visions but in her unwavering certainty and her ability to articulate a vision of French destiny that resonated with desperate nobles seeking any hope of reversing their fortunes. More crucially, she possessed an intuitive understanding of military strategy and an almost supernatural ability to inspire confidence in demoralized troops. The siege of Orleans had dragged on for months, with English forces slowly strangling the last major French stronghold on the Loire River. The city's fall would have opened the path to the heart of France, potentially ending the war in England's favor. Joan's arrival transformed the dynamic entirely, not through miraculous intervention, but through her ability to convince both soldiers and civilians that victory was not only possible but inevitable. Her tactics were innovative, rapid, aggressive assaults that caught English commanders off guard, combined with psychological warfare that exploited the superstitions and fears of medieval soldiers who found themselves facing what appeared to be a divinely inspired opponent. The liberation of Orléans in May 1429 established Joan's reputation, but it also sealed her ultimate fate. English commanders, initially dismissive of what they saw as French desperation masquerading as divine mission, began to recognize the existential threat she represented. This was not merely another military setback that could be reversed through superior numbers or better tactics. Joan's success threatened the very legitimacy of English claims to French sovereignty, undermining years of careful political positioning and vast expenditures of blood and treasure. More dangerously still, Joan's victories began to coalesce French resistance around a unifying narrative of national destiny and divine favor. Her insistence on crowning the Dauphin at Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronations, represented a direct challenge to English legitimacy that could not be answered through conventional military means. The coronation ceremony, conducted in July 1429, with Joan standing beside the newly crowned Charles VII, marked the moment when her political usefulness to her own allies began to conflict with their long-term survival instincts. The nobles who had initially embraced Joan's cause now found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Her success had restored French morale and reversed the tide of war, but her growing independence and her direct relationship with the king threatened to upset the delicate balance of power within the French court. Joan's common origins, her illiteracy, and her habit of speaking directly to nobles as equals, rather than observing proper deference, made her a useful military asset, but a potentially dangerous political precedent. Charles VII, despite owing his crown largely to Joan's efforts, began to distance himself from his savior, as diplomatic considerations took precedence over military ones. The possibility of negotiating a favorable peace with England required demonstrating royal control over French forces, something difficult to accomplish, while a peasant girl commanded the loyalty of both soldiers and common people. The king's advisers, many of whom had initially opposed Joan's involvement, now whispered that her continued prominence might actually hinder efforts to secure a lasting settlement. This growing isolation left Joan increasingly vulnerable to the machinations of her enemies. English intelligence networks, frustrated by their inability to counter her battlefield success, began developing alternative strategies focused on destroying her reputation and divine authority. If Joan could be proven a heretic, a witch, or a fraud, her victories could be reframed as the products of diabolic intervention, rather than divine favor. Such a revelation would not only discredit her personally, but would cast doubt on the legitimacy of Charles VII's coronation and the broader French resistance movement. The opportunity came during the siege of Compiègne in May 1430. Joan, leading a small force in an attempt to relieve the besieged city, found herself cut off from retreat when Burgundian forces closed the trap. The circumstances of her capture remain controversial, with some historians suggesting that French nobles deliberately arranged her betrayal to remove an increasingly inconvenient ally. Whether through treachery or simple military misfortune, Joan fell into the hands of John of Luxembourg, a Burgundian vassal who immediately recognized the political and financial value of his prize. The negotiations for Joan's transfer to English custody revealed the cynical calculations that would ultimately determine her fate. John of Luxembourg demanded 10,000 francs for his prisoner, a sum that Charles VII could have raised but chose not to pay. The king's abandonment of Joan at this crucial moment demonstrated the fundamental shift in political priorities that had occurred since her initial success. What had begun as divine mission had transformed into political liability, and the woman who had saved France now found herself expendable in the pursuit of broader diplomatic objectives. English authorities, led by the Duke of Bedford, recognized that Joan's execution required careful orchestration to achieve maximum political impact. Simply killing her as a prisoner of war would create a martyr whose legend might prove even more dangerous than her living presence. Instead, she would be tried by an ecclesiastical court on charges of heresy, witchcraft, and violation of divine law. Such a trial would serve multiple purposes. It would provide legal cover for her execution, discredit her victories as products of diabolic influence, and demonstrate English control over the French church hierarchy. The selection of Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, to preside over Joan's trial was no accident. Cauchon had been driven from his diocese by Joan's military campaigns, giving him personal motivation for revenge, while his dependence on English patronage ensured his cooperation in reaching the predetermined verdict. The bishop's theological credentials provided the necessary ecclesiastical authority, while his political circumstances guaranteed his compliance with English objectives. The trial that began in February 1431 was a masterpiece of judicial theatre, choreographed with the precision of a military campaign and the cruelty of a medieval torture chamber. From the moment Joan was dragged into the chapel of Rouen Castle, shackled in iron chains that had left permanent scars on her wrists and ankles, every aspect of the proceedings was designed not to determine her guilt or innocence, but to construct a legal framework for her predetermined destruction. This was not justice. It was a carefully orchestrated performance where the verdict had been written before the first witness was called, and the only question remaining was how thoroughly her spirit could be broken before her body was consigned to the flames. Pierre Cauchon had assembled a tribunal of 69 clerics, each selected not for their theological wisdom, but for their willingness to participate in what amounted to judicial murder dressed in ecclesiastical robes. These were not impartial judges seeking truth, but collaborators in a political execution who understood that their own positions depended upon delivering the verdict their English patrons demanded. The University of Paris, that bastion of medieval learning, provided theological cover for what was essentially a show trial, lending academic credibility to proceedings that violated every principle of canonical law they claimed to uphold. The charges themselves revealed the desperate creativity of men seeking to criminalize the miraculous. Joan stood accused of 53 separate counts of heresy, witchcraft, blasphemy and crimes against nature, a laundry list of offenses so comprehensive and contradictory that they effectively made breathing while female a capital crime. She was simultaneously accused of being a sorceress who consorted with demons, and a fraud who invented her visions for personal gain. The prosecution argued that her military victories proved supernatural assistance, while insisting that such assistance could only have come from diabolic sources, creating a logical trap where success itself became evidence of guilt. Most insidiously, the tribunal focused obsessively on Joan's adoption of male clothing and armor, treating her cross-dressing as evidence of fundamental rebellion against divine order. In medieval theology, the maintenance of gender boundaries was considered essential to social stability, and Joan's assumption of masculine dress and military command represented a challenge to cosmic hierarchy that transcended mere personal choice. The cleric spent hours detailing the theological implications of her braided hair, her hose and doublet, her refusal to submit to male authority, as if the fabric of creation itself depended upon forcing her back into feminine subservience. The psychological warfare began immediately. Joan was confined in a secular prison rather than ecclesiastical custody, a violation of church law that placed her at the mercy of English guards, who had been explicitly instructed to break her spirit through constant harassment and the ever-present threat of sexual violence. She was kept in a cell barely large enough for her to lie down, lit only by a single window too high to reach, with leg irons that prevented her from standing fully upright. The isolation was absolute. No contact with supporters, no access to counsel, no opportunity to prepare any defense beyond her own faith, and increasingly fragmented memories. Sleep became impossible, as guards maintained constant surveillance, entering her cell at random intervals throughout the night, under the pretense of preventing suicide attempts. The real purpose was psychological destabilization, ensuring that Joan faced each day's interrogation in a state of exhaustion that would make coherent resistance increasingly difficult. Food arrived sporadically, and in quantities insufficient to maintain physical strength, while the constant dampness and cold of the stone chamber began to take their toll on her health within weeks of her imprisonment. The interrogations themselves followed a pattern designed to create an atmosphere of theological inevitability. Cauchon would begin each session with elaborate prayers and invocations of divine justice, creating the impression that God himself was conducting the proceedings through his chosen representatives. Joan, barely 19 and exhausted by months of imprisonment, was expected to engage in complex theological debates with some of the most learned scholars in Europe, men who had spent decades studying the subtle distinctions of doctrine and canon law that they now weaponized against her. Her responses, recorded by scribes who worked under explicit instructions to emphasize anything that could be construed as heretical or blasphemous, revealed a peasant girl's simple faith colliding with the sophisticated manipulation of professional interrogators. When asked if she knew whether she was in a state of grace, Joan delivered what should have been recognized as a masterpiece of theological insight. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Any competent theologian would have recognized this as an exemplary expression of humility and orthodox faith, but the tribunal twisted her words into evidence of presumptuous claims to divine favor. The prosecution's strategy centered on forcing Joan to choose between equally damning alternatives. If she maintained that her visions came from God, she was guilty of presumption and false prophecy. If she admitted they might have been fantasies or deceptions, she was confessing to fraud and leading French forces into battle under false pretenses. When she insisted that she would submit to the judgment of the Church, they demanded she specifically submit to the Church militant, their tribunal, rather than the Church triumphant in heaven, creating a trap where any appeal to higher authority became evidence of rebellious pride. Most cruelly, they exploited her illiteracy and peasant origins to create situations where her lack of formal education became evidence of moral deficiency. Joan could not read the charges against her, could not examine the theological texts cited to prove her errors, could not even verify that the scribes were accurately recording her responses. She was forced to rely entirely on the honesty of men who had already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate truth for political purposes. Trapped in a linguistic labyrinth, where every path led toward predetermined conclusions, the tribunal's treatment of her visions revealed the sophisticated theological machinery being deployed against her. Medieval Christianity accepted the reality of divine revelation, but distinguished between true visions sent by God and false ones inspired by demons or human pride. The clerics systematically deconstructed Joan's experiences, arguing that her saints had appeared to her in forms that contradicted established iconography, that they had given her worldly rather than spiritual counsel, and that their messages promoted war rather than peace. They demanded she produce physical proof of supernatural encounters, while simultaneously arguing that any such proof would itself be evidence of diabolic intervention. The most damning testimony came from witnesses who had known Joan before her rise to prominence, peasants and townspeople who had been coached to remember suspicious incidents that might indicate early signs of witchcraft or heretical tendencies. A childhood friend recalled that Joan had sometimes danced around a fairy tree, transforming innocent rural customs into evidence of pagan sympathies. Her mother's teachings about local saints were reframed as instruction in folk magic, while her unusual religious devotion as a child became retroactive proof of the pride and presumption that had led to her downfall. As weeks stretched into months, the psychological pressure began to show visible effects on Joan's physical and mental condition. Court observers noted that she had lost significant weight, that her responses became increasingly confused and contradictory, and that she sometimes appeared to be speaking to invisible presences during interrogation sessions. The tribunal seized upon these signs of breakdown as evidence that her demonic sponsors were abandoning her, that the supernatural forces that had once sustained her were withdrawing their support, now that her usefulness had ended. The threat of torture was introduced with calculated precision, not as an immediate reality but as an ever-present possibility that colored every exchange. Joan was taken to view the torture chamber, shown the instruments that awaited those who refused to confess their crimes, forced to listen to detailed explanations of how each device would be applied to extract truth from stubborn heretics. The psychological impact was devastating, creating a state of constant anticipation that proved more effective than actual physical torture in breaking down her resistance. When Joan finally agreed to sign a confession, the document presented to her was not the brief statement of submission she had expected, but a comprehensive recantation that portrayed her entire mission as the product of demonic deception. The confession, written in Latin that Joan could not read, declared that her visions had been fantasies, her military victories the result of diabolic assistance, and her cross-dressing evidence of fundamental rebellion against divine order. Most devastatingly, it required her to acknowledge that Charles VII's coronation had been illegitimate, undermining the very cause for which she had fought and suffered. The signing ceremony was choreographed as a public spectacle of submission, conducted in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen before a crowd of English officials, French collaborators, and curious townspeople. Joan, dressed in feminine clothing for the first time in months and visibly shaking from fear and exhaustion, was presented as a penitent sinner returning to the embrace of Holy Mother Church. Bishop Caution delivered a lengthy sermon on the mercy of God toward repentant heretics, while English soldiers maintained order among spectators who had come expecting to witness an execution. But the confession that should have saved Joan's life instead sealed her doom through a final act of manipulated cruelty. The document she signed promised life imprisonment rather than death, but the tribunal had already decided that her recantation would be temporary, that the psychological pressure of indefinite captivity would eventually drive her to renew her heretical claims and provide justification for the execution they had always intended. The confession was merely another stage in the elaborate judicial theatre, designed to demonstrate the Church's mercy, while ensuring that Joan's ultimate destruction appeared legally justified. The psychological breaking point came within days of her public confession, triggered by a resumption of male clothing that may have been forced upon her by guards seeking to create grounds for renewed charges. When Joan appeared before the tribunal dressed once again as a man, claiming that her saints had reproached her for the weakness that led to her recantation, Cauchon and his collaborators could barely contain their satisfaction. Here was the relapse they had engineered, the return to heretical behavior that canonical law declared worthy of death, without possibility of further mercy. The final condemnation was delivered with all the solemnity the Church could muster, transforming judicial murder into sacred duty. Joan of Arc was declared a relapsed heretic, turned over to secular authorities for execution, and abandoned by the institution that claimed to represent God's will on earth. The girl who had saved France would die not as a martyr to patriotism, but as a criminal condemned by the very Church whose authority she had never questioned, betrayed by men who transformed their own cowardice and collaboration into instruments of divine justice. The morning of May 30, 1431, dawned grey and depressive over Rouen, as if the very heavens recoiled from what was about to unfold in the ancient market square. By 7 o'clock, 30,000 souls had gathered in a grotesque festival of anticipation, their faces reflecting a mixture of morbid curiosity, political satisfaction, and the peculiar bloodlust that execution spectacles inspired in medieval crowds. English soldiers had cordoned off the square with military precision, their commanders understanding that this was not merely an execution but a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre, whose success would be measured, not in Joan's death alone, but in the psychological impact her destruction would have on French resistance movements across the occupied territories. The scaffold itself had been constructed with deliberate cruelty, rising nearly 8 feet above the crowd to ensure maximum visibility for the horror that was about to unfold. Unlike typical execution pyres, which were built low to allow for quick death from smoke inhalation, Joan's platform had been designed to prolong her suffering, to transform her final moments into an extended spectacle of agony that would sear itself into the memory of every witness. The executioner, a professional named Geoffrey Terrage, who had conducted dozens of burnings throughout his career, would later confess to his priest that he had never been ordered to construct a pyre specifically engineered to maximize suffering rather than efficiency. 3 separate platforms had been erected in ascending tiers, creating a ziggurat of death that would ensure Joan remained visible above the flames for as long as possible. The base level contained the heaviest logs, designed to create a foundation of coals that would burn slowly and steadily. The second tier held smaller wood and kindling, arranged to produce maximum flame and smoke. But it was the third level, where Joan would be chained, that revealed the true sadistic genius of the construction. Built high enough to keep her above the initial flames, the platform would expose her to intense heat and smoke while delaying the merciful unconsciousness that typically preceded death in properly constructed execution pyres. The psychological torture began before Joan even left her cell. Guards had awakened her before dawn, forcing her to listen to the sound of hammers and saws, as final preparations were made to the scaffold outside her window. They described in graphic detail what awaited her, explaining how the flames would first singe her hair and clothing, then begin to blister and char her exposed skin, while the smoke would sear her lungs and throat, making each breath an agony that would continue until her body finally surrendered to the inevitable. This was not mere cruelty for its own sake, but a calculated attempt to break her spirit one final time, to ensure that she would face her death not with the dignity of a martyr, but with the terror of a broken girl. When the guards finally came to escort her to the scaffold, Joan had to be physically supported, her legs barely able to carry her weight after months of confinement, and the overwhelming psychological pressure of facing imminent death. She had been dressed in a white shift, the traditional garment of penitent heretics, but beneath the simple fabric her body bore the marks of her imprisonment, the permanent scars left by leg irons, the weight loss that had left her gaunt and hollow-eyed, the tremor in her hands that spoke of a nervous system pushed beyond its limits. This was no longer the confident warrior who had liberated Orléans, but a physically and emotionally shattered teenager about to be sacrificed to the political ambitions of men who had never possessed a fraction of her courage. The procession through Rouen narrow streets became a gauntlet of hatred, orchestrated by English authorities who had positioned their supporters along the route to create an atmosphere of popular condemnation. Hired agitators shouted accusations of witchcraft and heresy, while English soldiers prevented any expressions of sympathy or support from French civilians who might have been moved by the sight of the broken girl shuffling toward her death. The psychological impact was devastating. Joan was forced to confront not just her impending execution, but the apparent reality that the people she had fought to save had turned against her, that her entire mission had been rejected by the very nation whose liberation she had made possible. Bishop Caution, resplendent in his ceremonial robes, delivered the final sermon with all the theatrical gravitas he could muster. His words, carefully crafted to justify the proceedings as an act of divine mercy, transformed Joan's execution into a theological necessity, a cleansing fire that would purify not just her corrupted soul, but the entire realm from the heretical contamination she had introduced. The bishop's voice carried across the silent crowd as he declared that Joan's death would serve as a warning to all who would presume to challenge the natural order, all who would claim divine authority for their rebellions against legitimate power. It was a performance worthy of the most accomplished actor, delivered by a man who had successfully convinced himself that his collaboration in judicial murder was actually service to God. The moment of chaining Joan to the stake revealed the full horror of what had been planned. Rather than the single chain typically used in executions, she was bound with multiple iron restraints that held her upright and prevented any possibility of collapsing into the flames for a quicker death. Her arms were secured behind her back and chained to the stake itself, while additional bindings around her waist and legs ensured that she would remain vertical throughout the ordeal. Most cruelly, a metal collar was placed around her neck, designed not just to prevent escape, but to hold her head upright so that her face would remain visible to the crowd, even as the flames began their work. The executioner's reluctance was evident to those who watched closely. Terrage moved with the mechanical precision of a man following orders against his own judgment, his usual professional confidence replaced by visible distress at what he had been commanded to do. When he later testified about the execution, he would describe the unusual instructions he had received: to build the fire slowly, to ensure maximum visibility of the victim's suffering, to prolong the spectacle as long as possible rather than allowing for the quick death that professional executioners typically provided as a final mercy. As the torches were applied to the kindling, the crowd fell into an expectant silence, broken only by the crackle of igniting wood and the prayers that Joan began to recite in a voice that carried clearly across the square. Her words, calling upon Jesus Christ and the saints she claimed had guided her, revealed a faith that remained unshaken, despite months of psychological torture and the immediate prospect of the most horrible death medieval justice could devise. This was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire spectacle, not Joan's terror, which might have been expected, but her continued spiritual composure in the face of ultimate horror. The flames began their ascent with deliberate slowness, the carefully arranged wood creating the prolonged burning that English authorities had demanded. Smoke began to billow around the platform, but the height of Joan's position kept her above the worst of it initially, ensuring that the crowd could witness every moment of her ordeal. Her white shift began to smolder and char, the fabric clinging to her skin as the heat intensified. Yet throughout these opening moments of her torment, Joan continued to pray aloud, her voice maintaining a clarity that seemed supernatural to observers who had expected screams and pleas for mercy. The psychological impact on the crowd was immediate and unexpected. Blightablites, many who had come expecting to witness the destruction of a heretic and enemy of England, found themselves confronted with the reality of watching a teenage girl die in agony while maintaining an unwavering faith that put their own spiritual convictions to shame. English soldiers were forced to threaten spectators, who began to weep openly or call out for mercy, while several witnesses would later report that they had to leave the square before the execution was completed, unable to stomach the reality of what was unfolding before them. As the flames reached the second tier of the scaffold, the true horror began. The intense heat caused Joan's remaining clothing to catch fire, and the smoke grew thick enough to begin affecting her breathing. Yet even as her body began to show the visible effects of the flames, her voice could still be heard calling upon Christ and declaring her innocence of the charges that had condemned her. This continuation of prayer in the face of ultimate agony created a profound dissonance among witnesses who had been told they were watching divine justice being administered to a heretic and fraud. The executioner, positioned close enough to see Joan's suffering in detail, later described the moment when the flames finally reached the top platform. The heat was so intense that her hair ignited instantly, creating a crown of fire around her head that seemed to some observers like a hideous parody of saintly illumination. Her skin began to blister and blacken, yet still she maintained consciousness and continued her prayers, creating a spectacle that burned itself into the memory of every witness. Taraj would confess that in 30 years of conducting executions, he had never seen anyone maintain such composure while enduring such torture. The duration of Joan's conscious suffering exceeded even the worst expectations of those who had planned her execution. The deliberately constructed pyre ensured that she remained alive and aware far longer than typical burning victims, experiencing every moment of the flames' assault on her body. Witnesses reported that her prayers continued for nearly 15 minutes after the fire reached the top platform, her voice growing weaker but never stopping entirely until the smoke finally overwhelmed her ability to speak. Even then, observers claimed they could see her lips moving in silent prayer until the very end. When death finally came, it arrived not as the merciful release that executioners typically provided, but as the gradual surrender of a body that had endured beyond the normal limits of human suffering. The crowd that had gathered in anticipation of a political spectacle found themselves witnesses to something that transcended their expectations, not the destruction of a heretic, but the martyrdom of a saint, whose faith had proven stronger than the most sophisticated cruelties her enemies could devise. The aftermath revealed the profound miscalculation English authorities had made in orchestrating such a prolonged and visible execution. Rather than breaking French morale, Joan's death became a rallying point for resistance movements that transformed her from a military leader into a spiritual symbol whose power transcended her physical destruction. The very witnesses who were meant to spread word of her heretical end instead carried stories of her unwavering faith and dignified death, creating a narrative of martyrdom that no amount of official propaganda could counter. Even more disturbing were the reports that began to circulate about supernatural phenomena associated with her execution. Multiple witnesses claimed that when the flames finally consumed her body, her heart was found intact among the ashes, refusing to burn despite the intense heat that had reduced everything else to cinders. The executioner himself reported this discovery to his superiors, describing his horror at finding the organ that medieval theology considered the seat of the soul preserved amid the destruction of everything else. English authorities ordered the heart to be cast into the Seine, but the damage to their narrative was already done. The political consequences of Joan's execution ultimately proved catastrophic for English interests in France. Her death galvanized French resistance in ways that her life never could have accomplished, transforming a peasant girl's military victories into a spiritual crusade for national liberation. Charles VII, who had abandoned Joan during her captivity, found himself forced to embrace her memory, as French forces began driving English armies from territories they had held for generations. The very spectacle that was meant to demonstrate English power instead revealed the fundamental weakness of an occupation that required the torture and murder of teenage girls to maintain itself. Within 25 years of her execution, English forces had been expelled from all French territory except Calais, their centuries-long dream of continental empire reduced to a single-channel port. The war that Joan's death was meant to end instead became a French victory so complete that it transformed the medieval balance of power and established France as the dominant European monarchy. The girl they had burned as a heretic was eventually canonized as a saint, her rehabilitation by the very church that had condemned her serving as a final, devastating indictment of the men who had orchestrated her destruction. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of Joan's execution lies not in its political consequences, but in its revelation of how easily men can convince themselves that their cruelest acts serve the highest purposes. Every participant in her trial and execution, from Bishop Cauchon to the common soldiers who maintained order in the square, justified their actions as necessary service to God, king, and country. They transformed their fear of a teenage girl's courage into theological necessity, their political calculations into divine mandate, their cowardice into righteousness. In doing so, they created a template for the bureaucratized evil that would plague humanity for centuries to come, proving that the most horrific atrocities are committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who have learned to call their brutality justice. The smoke that rose from Joan's pyre carried with it not just the ashes of a 19-year-old girl, but the final remnants of medieval chivalry's pretensions to honor and the comfortable myth that institutional authority necessarily serves divine purpose. In their desperate attempt to destroy a symbol of resistance, Joan's enemies had instead created the most powerful martyr in French history, while simultaneously revealing the moral bankruptcy of their own cause. The flames that were meant to end her story instead ensured its eternal continuation, transforming a peasant girl from Domremy into an immortal symbol of courage confronting corruption, faith triumphing over expedience, and the ultimate powerlessness of earthly authority when faced with genuine spiritual conviction.